Well, dear listeners, welcome back at the beginning of a new, and I hope peculiar year. A year arrives as an open page, and an open page asks for a voice that carries accuracy alongside appetite, since culture grows legible when we follow its smallest rituals to their hidden engines. Ireland, during the later 20th century, lived through a stubborn series of recalibrations, urban expansion that altered the cadence of ordinary life, educational reforms that widened access while tightening assessment, and a public discourse that argued over authority in church, state and home, so that the classroom, far from behaving as a neutral room with desks, became a site where the nation rehearsed itself in miniature. Within that atmosphere, language served as more than a tool. It functioned as a gate, a badge, a test and a promise, especially when speech carried the weight of class, gender and inherited expectation. Eavan Boland enters this landscape with a biography already marked by movement and translation, a childhood shaped by travel, an adolescence haunted by the pull of Dublin and the pressure of elsewhere, and a writer's life spent negotiating what a public tradition permits a woman to say, while rewarding certain tones and punishing others. Her work grows from that friction, because she writes with a precise ear for how institutions sound, how reputations form, and how private experience becomes visible through craft. She also writes as someone who understood, early and sharply, that the great subjects of poems often arrive disguised as ordinary objects, and that a single word can carry a whole social order in its syllables. Tonight's episode circles a figure many of us remember with peculiar clarity. A woman at the blackboard, hand-lifted, voice calibrated, presence sharpened by attention. Stay close, because the board holds more than lessons. Listen now to A Woman at the Blackboard, a lecture on Eavan Boland as classrooms shape power and memory through grammar. Chalk dust drifts through a pale shaft of winter sun, while it settles on the cuff of a woman whose hand, as it steadies itself beside a blackboard, carries the minute tremor of someone who has learned that public speech always exacts a private price. Since a classroom multiplies attention, while it also exposes the speaker to the hawk-eyed appetite of the young, Boland's teachers stages instruction as a drama of visibility, in which the body that teaches becomes a surface upon which community writes its desires, its jokes, and its punishments, so that what looks like pedagogy discloses itself as a ritual of civic power. When Boland turns toward the teacher, she chooses an emblem whose familiarity disguises its cruelty, since the teacher functions as a sanctioned voice, whose task involves repeating shared values, while that repetition hardens into costume, posture, and the oddly official cadence that a room expects from the person at its front. In the prose piece circulated under the title Teachers, a sentence lands with the blunt precision of a chalk tap. The difficulty about teachers is that they are teachers, and as it circles back on itself, it performs the trap it names, because the word teachers doubles as identity and accusation, so that the speaker who describes the teacher simultaneously becomes ensnared by the social role whose seams she exposes. Boland's lifelong argument with inherited forms, which she frames as a tension between experiment and communal obligation, matters here, since the teacher occupies that same quarrelsome hinge, given that the teacher speaks for tradition, even when she hungers for a free addiction. When Boland, in conversation, recalls the communal shadows that fall across Irish poems, she locates a pressure that grows heavier in any room designed for instruction, because a classroom represents community condensed into a timetable, where authority arrives prescripted, and where the risk of improvisation carries social consequence. The poem's classroom, which resembles the Ireland that raised Boland's earliest readers, belongs to an era when cultural legitimacy still clung to a narrow canon, while women's experience, even when it filled the country's houses and hospitals, lived at the edge of official speech. For a poet whose work insists that domestic fact bears historical weight, the teacher becomes an exquisite test case, because she stands inside an institution whose business depends upon definitions, while she also carries the daily knowledge of bodies, weather, hunger, fatigue, and the small urgencies that never gain the dignity of examination papers. A detail in Teachers has passed through many readings with the quiet success that true disguises enjoy, the word imperative. It appears as an adjective describing the role, which tends to be imperative as regards behavior, and since imperative names a grammatical mood as well as an ethical command, Boland folds syntax into the social, thereby suggesting that the teacher's authority arises through grammar long before it arrives through personality. Once that hinge becomes visible, teachers shifts, because it stops resembling a mere portrait of school life, and starts behaving as an ars poetica about command, address, and the treacherous sweetness of being heard. In light of that grammatical pressure, the classroom becomes a laboratory in which language exposes its coercive habits, since the imperative mood trains bodies as much as it trains sentences, while it persuades the listener that obedience possesses the aura of sense. Boland's teacher, whose womanhood complicates authority in a culture that long treated female speech as either ornament or transgression, carries that imperative in her throat, while she also feels how quickly her voice can be reduced to an expected sound, the way a bell reduces time to a command. Boland's creative milieu, which formed under the long afterglow of modernism and the ongoing contest over Irish identity, gave her a set of inherited idols: Yeatsian public grandeur, bardic continuity, nationalist iconography, and it also gave her the ordinary rooms whose significance tradition had learned to overlook. The classroom belongs to that second category because it is a public room that looks ordinary, while it manufactures the citizen's relation to language, to history, and to the sanctioned stories that a nation repeats until repetition seems like truth. It teaches the young audience, whose covert looks and sly giggles appear in the prose version, behaves like an alternative chorus because it responds to authority with mimicry, and as it imitates every physical tique and vocal characteristic, it reveals that power in a classroom depends upon performance, even when it pretends to depend upon knowledge. Boland, whose ear for tone registers the difference between a voice that speaks and a voice that plays a role, makes that mimicry feel like a shadow pedagogy in which students teach the teacher how authority will be received. You speak as though the room belongs to you. The room rents itself through attention. Then your lesson carries a landlord's key. My chalk carries a witness. Dialogue like this, which Boland's work often invites even when it remains unstated, presses the ethical question that teachers keeps turning in its hands. What kind of authority can a woman inhabit when authority itself has been trained to sound like someone else? Since Boland insists that poetry begins where certainty ends, the teacher figure offers a painful advantage, because she is asked to embody certainty while she lives as a person who changes, who bruises, who remembers, and who holds private sorrow behind a public lesson. The overlooked imperative also refracts Boland's fascination with pronouns, grammar, and the tiny mechanisms by which a sentence assigns power, because an imperative assumes a you, while it also erases the chooser who issues the command, so that the command can arrive from the world itself. In that light, the teacher's role becomes a ventriloquism, since she speaks in the name of syllabi, parents' memories, and institutional expectations, while she also experiences in the body the cost of being reduced to a mouthpiece. Such reduction speaks to Boland's larger project, which involves restoring fullness of being to figures flattened by national myth, while she exposes how language, when it serves ideology, turns people into types. The prose teachers names this directly when it observes that nicknames dehumanize, while it compares classroom naming to wartime naming, which suggests that the classroom, for all its small desks and soft pencils, rehearses the rhetoric by which groups justify cruelty. Once the teacher becomes a target of naming, she becomes a figure of dispossession, and the poem's social world begins to resemble a miniature polity. Boland's lineage as the daughter of a diplomat, and as a young poet who moved between Dublin and abroad, sharpened her sense that language carries borders inside it, since accents, idioms, and grammatical habits can exile a speaker even when she stands in a room full of people. The classroom intensifies this because it polices correctness with a fervour that often exceeds the needs of meaning, while it makes the child's tongue into an emblem of belonging, and by extension makes the teacher into a border guard whose own inner life may resist the task. For a woman teacher in an Irish classroom shaped by Catholic respectability and by a public rhetoric that praised motherhood while it limited female autonomy, the act of speaking publicly carries a double exposure, because she teaches language while she also teaches the social permission to use language. Boland, whose poems return to domestic labour as a site of history, understands that such permission always arrives entangled with risk, since speech can threaten the image that a community demands from women, and since authority, when it sits on a female body, draws scrutiny that male authority evades. The poem's central object, the chalk itself, serves as more than prop, because it embodies the paradox of instruction. It marks, it vanishes, it marks again, while it leaves residue on skin and cloth as a reminder that knowledge, even when it claims permanence, lives through repetition and erasure. In Boland's hands, chalk becomes an ethics of revision, since the teacher writes, writes, and thereby performs a cycle that echoes the poet's own struggle with syntax, with voice, and with the demand that a sentence carry both the pressure of tradition and the pulse of lived experience. When Teachers is read through the lens of Boland's broader work, the classroom scene stops serving as a mere setting and becomes a metaphysical chamber, because it asks what a human voice becomes when it is filtered through role, while it also asks what self remains when language turns the speaker into function. Since the imperative mood hides its author, and since it presents command as necessity, the teacher stands as an emblem of the deepest metaphysical anxiety in Boland's oeuvre. The fear that language itself may speak through us, while it recruits us into histories we never chose. Memory enters this poem with the stealth of dust, because every classroom contains, as an atmosphere, the teachers one has already had, whose voices linger in the ear long after their bodies have left the building. Boland, who speaks of ordinary objects becoming familiar, then known, then visionary, gives the teacher's implements, chalk, board, desk, bell, the strange glamour of relics, since they hold the imprint of countless small obediences and resistances, and since they preserve in their worn surfaces the history of persons learning how to speak. What, then, counts as the poem's singular, previously unobserved detail, when so much of Boland's work has been read with attentive care? The answer lies in the grammatical pun that hides in plain sight, imperative as grammar, imperative as moral force, imperative as the social compulsion that turns a woman into an office. Once that pun is taken seriously, Teachers shifts from social commentary into a meditation on command itself, and the teacher's body becomes the site where metaphysics meets daily life, because the question becomes less about schooling and more about the nature of address. Who speaks when a sentence orders, and who pays? You taught them a language. Our language taught me my limits. Our limits carry edges that cut. Edges carry maps. Boland's own account of living between Irish and American poetry worlds, and of feeling both at home and pressured by heritage, suggests that Teachers also encodes a transatlantic sensitivity, because it frames authority as something that varies by culture while it remains, in any classroom, the form of power enacted through speech. The teacher who stands amid those variations embodies the poet's predicament, since poets inherit forms they never authored, while they also risk isolation when they break them. The lecture room in which I speak these sentences mirrors Boland's classroom, since both depend upon a temporary contract between voice and audience, and since both invite the listener's private mockery, as well as their sincere hunger for meaning. In that mirrored space, Teachers becomes less a portrait than a warning, because it suggests that every institution built on language will try to naturalize its own imperatives, while it asks the speaker to supply the illusion that command equals truth. Boland's achievement, which resides in her ability to make an ordinary scene argue, emerges here through the smallest turn of diction, since imperative carries a whole theory of civic speech within a single word, and since it lets her expose the mechanism by which a woman in a classroom becomes a figure for the poet inside a nation. The chalk dust returns, it glints, it lands, it enters the lungs, and the teacher's hand keeps writing, because the imperative keeps demanding its you, while the woman who speaks inside that demand keeps searching for a syntax that can carry her fully. The uncountably shaped end arrives when the board stands half erased, while the room empties into corridor noise, and while the teacher remains alone for a moment, since she feels the authority drain from her voice as the audience leaves, even as the residue of her words clings to the air. The chalk, which has served as witness, stays in her fingers as a quiet weight, while it suggests that command, memory, and personhood share the same fragile medium. And while the question persists, whether any you who receives an imperative ever hears the speaker behind it, or whether the sentence itself, with its old communal shadows, continues speaking after the woman turns out the light,